So, hello everybody. Welcome back to macroeconomics. And if you are following the news, then also within the parliament of Germany, they started a really hard discussion where economically, especially Germany and Europe as a whole, will go the next year. And I think where the path economically will be for Germany will be one of the main questions for the next poll within the next year in Germany. So, for this, we are in the part that we are discussing the main aim system of Germany when we are look at the economic performance of our country, and there in general we are looking, of course, on the main aggregate variable, GDP, and we are measuring via real GDP economic growth. But of course, also we are interested where the prices are going. So the second main aim is price level stability, and these two we had in the last lectures. The economic growth measured by real GDP, and a general aim would be roughly for developed countries that we are aiming an economic growth rate per year in real GDP of 1 to 3%. Then we discussed, of course, the possibility how we get rid of the prices, because of course we can think of that GDP as we defined it in the beginning can also just rise by a price rise. And I gave you here some time series, and especially this one here. There we see the dramatic difference between measuring economic performance with nominal rates. So nominal GDP really pushed up very high during the last years, while the real performance was not that good, and especially if you see it here, growth rate of more than 6% in nominal rates last year, and we have been shrinking in real terms the last year. And roughly it will be the same this year, that we are supposed to shrink again in real terms and maybe a nominal growth rate of 3 or 4%, we will see. So this you really should keep in mind, because if you think also for yourself, it doesn't count that you have a large number on your banking account, 10,000 euros, but what matters is what can you buy with your 10,000 euros. And if the price level in history has dramatically increased as we had it in the last 3 years, then the large number at your banking account doesn't really matter for you. So please keep this in mind. We will later come on again to these differences when we are talking about interest rates. There we will do also the difference between real and nominal rates. Okay, and in this topic, of course, then we also discussed the aim of price level stability, because that's what also these difference between real and nominal rates is about. There we discussed how we are measuring price level stability via a price index. so that this price index is calculated looking at a representative household, and then the price index is just the weighted arithmetic mean of this basket, what in general a representative household in our country is consuming. So let's write down this also, weighted arithmetic mean. I think you have talked in your statistic course about different possibilities how to calculate a mean. And well, if you go back in the beginning of the lecture where I made this difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, there I also said to you that many things in macroeconomics, when we are talking about the economy as a whole, then many things are about how do I aggregate my numbers. Okay, and then last week we were calculating also inflation just by a simple example where we looked at the two goods economy, and here we have the weights 30 and 70% of our two goods, and then the basket was just the weighted arithmetic mean 1 times 0.3 plus 0.8 times 0.7. Then we just choose 1 year as 100, and there I recommended that you maybe try at home, just setting not the first year to 100, but just another year to 100, and then you will see that you will end up at the same inflation rates. And this is what we where we all almost always interested, that we are not interested in the absolute values of our aggregates, but that we are interested in the change, in the relative change, so in the growth rates. So economic growth, there we have it in our parameter growth rate. Inflation is nothing else than a growth rate, and an interest rate is also nothing else than a growth rate. It is the growth rate of our capital we have invested. We will come to this also the next time. And then in red, please keep this also in mind. Then in the long run, of course, we are not interested always in the definite number in 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, but we want to have an idea what was the general economic performance, what was the general rise of interest rates during the last years, and then we have to also take the mean of these growth rates, inflation rates, and in this case, please keep in mind that you have to take the geometric mean, and this geometric mean is not the geometric mean of the inflation rates, but at first you have to take the geometric mean of the inflation factors. And let me put this maybe as a recapitulation also up here, because one of your fellow students recommended this, that I should recapitulate this. So inflation factor from 2018 and 2019. This is the price index. These were the inflation rates, and then the inflation factor is 1 plus the inflation rate. So we have 1 plus 0.1977. This is inflation factor of 2018 and 1 plus 0.04146. This is inflation factor of 2019. Oh, I don't have the chat. And hopefully everything is working, but otherwise you would have told me this. So, and we are coming from a price index of 100. So 100, this is index of 2017. And then we end up here at 121 times 5.8. And in order to average our growth rate, then we think of which growth rate do we need 2 times in a row, which is not changing. Here we are changing from 19% to 1.4%. Which growth rate do we need, which is not changing over the last 2 years, to also end up from 100 at 121. So this is then 1 plus pi bar plus pi bar times 100. Well, and this is then of course 1 plus pi bar to the square. And this then means that we have to take the root of our two explicit inflation factors, which are differing in 2018 and 2019, and this is nothing else than taking the geometric mean. So geometric mean is multiplying two numbers and taking the root, or in general multiplying n numbers and taking the nth root. This maybe we can also write down again here. Blue. So arithmetic mean is 1 over n, sum I from 1 to n over xi, and geometric mean is product I from 1 to n xi, and now not dividing by n, but taking the nth root. Well, maybe you wonder why I'm doing this again and again and again. Well, I quite often post the questions, just calculate, given some numbers, inflation rates, and afterwards taking, please calculate the average inflation rate. And during the last years, I get then as an answer almost all combinations of these numbers with plus, minus, multiplication, division, and so on. Well, I think it is not that hard to calculate this, but please do it also at home again. We will do it also once or twice within this lecture until the end of this lecture, but please recapitulate this also at home. Okay, so then let's go back to our magic square, or no, we are not really done. So because now we talked a lot about inflation rate, which we find in the news, in the media, and there we are focusing at our private consumption. If nothing else is written down in some news, then you can think of with inflation is just meant the change of the price level for private consumption. And this is then measured with the consumer price index. But of course, and in a minute, we will see that this has a large impact when we are discussing changes in prices. We had also this GDP deflator, and this GDP deflator represents the price changes of the whole economy. So consumer price index, if you think of private consumption, this was roughly 50% of GDP. So this is, of course, the largest part, but it is not the whole economy. And this represents the whole economy. And therefore, of course, in general, the price index of the whole economy and the price index of the main part of the economy, they will differ. And what this difference could have for implications about this, we will talk in a minute. But what we also are especially interested in Germany is, I told you, we are relative comparing the largest economies in the world, more or less the largest trader in the world. And therefore, of course, we are depending highly also at import and export prices. And if you go maybe to the statistical office, then of course also you find their price indices for export goods and import goods. And well, one main import good still for is where we are depending still highly on it is of course the oil price. And we will do in a minute also an example what changes in oil price will have for an impact on inflation. Because via this we can somehow import inflation if the exchange rate is not directly adjusting. Well, and what is also interesting, especially when you want to make a forecast, where is inflation going in the future, then we can have a look at the so-called whole price index. So if we looking at the trading part, so if you go to the supermarket, then the supermarket has bought all his goods in a wholesale market. And so to speak, if you see that in the wholesale price index that you have there a rise, then you shouldn't be very surprised when within the next months also the prices for final consumption in the supermarket is rising. This will not be the case directly, but if you have a longer increase in the wholesale prices, then of course in the next time this we will find also in final consumption in consumer price index, and therefore especially these whole price index can be used as an early indicator for the inflation rate. Okay, so for this I also wanted to discuss some other price indices, and now, as I already mentioned it, if we look at the difference of the performance of CPI and the GDP deflator, then what we see is that during the last 25 years, we had until the global financial crisis a long period of roughly 10 years where the so-called inflation rate, if I do not say anything else, then inflation rate just means development of consumer price index, that the inflation rate was higher than the relative change of GDP deflator. So here, period where the inflation rate was larger than the development of the price level of the whole economy measured by the GDP deflator. And here we had roughly a situation where it was the other way around, or where somehow the performance of both indices were at the same level. So here, maybe I can copy this. Oops. And now I have to change this one. Let's say lower or equal. So, and why is this interested? Why is this interesting? Well, later on we will talk about unemployment. And now, what is the main price at the labor market? If we look at the labor market, what is the price, or what is the name of the price at the labor market in a macroeconomic sense? At which price we are focusing at labor markets? I think somebody of you is also working. In what are you interested when you start to work? Yep, at the wages, of course. So, and you think of what is my ability? How much I want to earn? 15 euros per hour, 25, 30, 100 euros per hour. You are interested in your wage. And now you can think of I'm working for the last 5, 10 years. And you think about yourself, well, I'm doing a good job. And then prices measured by inflation, by consumer prices, are rising by 2, 3, 4, 5%. And let's say you are earning 50,000 euros per year. And the prices measured by the consumer price index has risen the last year by 5%. What will you do? You will go to your human resource division and you will say, well, I'm doing still a good job, but if I still earn only 50,000 euros per year, then you pay me relative less money because with these 50,000 euros, I can buy in the future less goods because the price level measured by the consumer prices, the final consumption. So what I'm buying with my 50,000 euros I'm earning has risen by 5%. And then you will say, well, it would be okay if you are increasing my wage level also by 5%. So, and now we are going to this period here. Here, roughly 2, in the end, almost 3% increase of consumer prices. So you are going to your human resource division and asking for an increase of your wage of 2.5% or something like this. So what will be the answer of your company? Well, in general, the company is not only selling final goods. Think of what we have seen when we looked at total production. Total production is twice as large as GDP. So measured in euros, we have as much intermediate goods as we have goods for final consumption. Also, we have also these investment goods. We have public goods. Final private consumption is only 50% of GDP. So on average, the companies will say, well, I understand you, of course. You are doing still a good job, and I understand your arguments that you don't want to earn relatively less. But then comes the argument, and this you hopefully have done in your introductory courses in business administration, microeconomics, and maybe also investment, that, of course, wages are one of the main cost part of the companies. And then in this situation here, the companies will argue, well, on general, the price at which I can sell my products has on average risen the last years only by roughly 1%. And let's say here, roughly 2%. Well, and then the argumentation is, I understand your arguments, but if I'm paying you these higher wage to 2.5%, then I'm increasing my costs more than the increase of the general price for which I can sell my products. And what does this would mean for the next years or in the medium term? As a company, I have a huge problem because my costs are increasing faster than my revenue. Well, and then maybe for the next 3 years, you have a higher wage, But in the fourth year, maybe your company doesn't exist anymore. And so here, in such a situation, we would see in general a struggle at the labor market. In the labor market, because, and now the employees are looking in general at inflation, this measured at with CPI, for the rise of their wages, and the companies are looking in general at the price changes measured by GDP, sorry. GDP deflator. And this then would mean that in such a period, we will see problems at the labor market. Here, we won't really expect that the people stop working in order to increase their wages. And actually, if you look at this period, we didn't see really a struggle at the labor market. This just started when prices started to really increase, and especially in these times here also again rose faster than the yellow line GDP deflator. And well, actually, a period like this, if we go back further in history, this is, yeah, not the normal situation. In general, we see that inflation rate measured by consumer price index is higher than the change of GDP deflator. Well, of course, for the future, we have to see if we have a new normal situation. We also thought that after the global financial crisis, where we had the drop in a minute, where we had the drop of interest rates going to zero, we just said, well, this is a quite unusual situation. In the next 1 or 2 years, we will see a rise again, and then we had the so-called new normal situation of zero interest rates of almost 10 years. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in this case, you can think of you are coming to your company, to your human resource division, and you are looking at the development of the blue line. So in this case, this would be maybe roughly, let's say, 1.5%. And you see that the yellow line has the same or even a little bit higher price development. So the yellow line, let's say maybe 1.7% on average. So, and then your company can say, well, is it possible that I increase your wages? And they look, well, I can sell my products even with an increase which is higher than what you want to have. So in this case, it would be much easier that you came together. Because in this case, the company, on average, of course, you have to look here not only at a single company, but at the labor market as a whole, at the economy as a whole. And here, in such a situation, in general, the company could say, well, of course, because my selling prices have risen even higher than what you want to have, then I can say, well, let's do it, and I increase your wages by 1.5% because I can sell my products with a price has risen by 1.7%. Okay? So then let's say, so in this case, but let's write this down. In this case, employees want to have a higher wage increase than the change of the selling prices of the companies. And let's take another color. And in such a period, the wanted wage increase of employees is not higher than the increase of the general selling prices. Okay. So, and in order to be complete, here I also show you the price development in the long run, and especially when you are looking at the left diagram, then quite often it is told in Germany, well, before we have introduced the euro, everything was better, and I want to have back the German mark because the German mark has been much more stable than the euro. And this is called what we call in economics a myopic view. So if you are looking only in the short distance sharp, Because if we look in general, and this is the German mark times, then during these times we had an average inflation rate of 3.5%. And even if we take these period of very high inflation rates in the last 3 years into account, in general, we have an inflation rate since we had introduced the euro of 1.8%. And if you look now at the aim of where should be the inflation rate, then on average in the medium term it should be roughly at 2%. So of course you can criticize in many points the monetary policy of the um, ECB. But if we are looking at the main aim of the ECB, then we could say, looking at the last 20 years, they roughly made it what they have promised. So this is roughly the aim for price level stability. And yeah, the forecast for the next year is, or for this year 2024, is that we will roughly end up at 2.5% or something like this. So we are almost back at the price level which we are aiming. And here also you see, if we take the monthly performance, that even within these crisis situations, global financial crisis, Corona, maybe in this one we had the euro crisis. So always in a crisis situation, then in general we see that inflation rates are dropping down to zero, or even prices are decreasing. Well, and what happens within a crisis situation? This diagram you have seen in my course, and hopefully you have seen it quite often in other courses. Well, in a crisis situation, especially private households are not going outside and buying and buying and buying, but they stay at home and keep their money within their pockets. And what does it mean? This means within a crisis situation, we would expect that demand is shifting to the left. Well, and then, of course, the prime within a crisis, we expect that demand curve is shifting to the left, and this implies a price decrease. So what we actually then see, at least ex post, we see that our economic theory is working. Well, we are not that good in always forecast where is the price level in the next 6 months or in the next 12 months. But then if we went through a change of the general framework of our economy. And then when we take a look back, then in general, we see, well, our market theory functions quite well, and ex post we can explain the development of our indicators. So here we also see always that inflation rates went down. And one last part, saving, is that I want to discuss with you the impact of a change of energy prices on inflation. And what I show here is the general inflation rate, the blue line, measured via CPI. And then you see that energy prices, especially mainly driven by oil prices, that they are fluctuating much more than the general inflation rate. So the energy component, we see we have here a drop of -10, and of course after Russia invaded in the Ukraine, an increase of even 40%, but also if you go back in time, so energy component fluctuates quite often plus minus 10 or 20%. So that is not a very surprising situation if this component is fluctuating that much. And now when we are looking at how do we calculate our consumer price index, then we have had here these different categories. And then, of course, we can think of in many categories, we find energy prices. Think, of course, here when we are looking at transport. Well, transport, very much of our transport is done with the railway, with cars and so on. And then the transport price component also indirectly depends on energy prices or housing, electricity, and so on. Maybe you know also that gas prices somehow follow the oil prices. They are slightly coupled at the oil prices at the international market. And then if we go more deeply into the direct calculation of our consumer price index, then we can identify more or less all the direct single goods and services which are directly depend on energy prices in general. And then we find that the energy component makes roughly 10% of consumer prices. So, and now, just as an example, we look here, we come from a very high level and then it is going down very much. Maybe you are driving a car, then go back 2 or 3 years, then for gasoline you have paid 2 and more euros, and right now it's, I think, roughly 1.70 or something like this. So roughly 15%, 20% less than 2 years ago. So, and now if we assume this, that energy prices in general have fallen compared to the last year by 20% and keeping all other prices at the same level, what would be the inflation rate? How do we calculate this? What do we have to do? Well, at t equals 0, this is the last year, we would have a CPI of 100. Well, and now we are dividing our CPI just in two components. One energy component, 10%, and one non-energy, all other goods component. So we are starting at 100. Then we would say our 10% energy component also starts at 100. Plus our 90%, we are also starting at our price level 100 non-energy component, and this is our 100. What do we have in t equals 1? So this would be CPI 0. How do we have to calculate then CPI at time t equals 1? What do we have to change relative to our starting year 0? Are the wages changing? The 10 and the 90%? Is there said anything about it? So this one 10%, this one 90%. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, prices, but prices. Yeah? And the energy component as a weight has 10%. So is this 10% changing? Think of how do we calculate a consumer price index as the weighted arithmetic mean. And this means that over, at least for the medium term, that we hold all our wages constant over time. So still it is these 10%. So we had 0.1, and now the prices have been fallen by 20%. So I have to multiply this with, yeah, pardon? 0.2? Yeah, but we are coming from a price level of 100. And this is dropping by 20%. 80, of course. So this is now the so-called sub-price index for the energy component. maybe I write this also down. This is price index of energy component, and this is the index of the non-energy part. So, and this drop of 20% from 100 to 80. So then we have the weight 90%. This is the energy component. And this I have to multiply with all other prices staying constant. Yep. Yes, of course. So this is the non-energy component, and these prices stay constant compared to t equals 0. So, and then we end up with 0.1 times 80 plus 0.9 times 100 is 98. So CPI in T equals 1 is 98. And what is then inflation? Measured by the relative change of CPI. Well, starting at T is 0, 100, oh sorry, starting as I mentioned it with the price level today. This is our 98 CPI of T equals 1 minus what was the price level in general the last year. So 100 CPI T equals 0 divided, since we want to have a relative number, divided by the price level of the former year. So divided by 100, again CPI of T equals 0, and then of course minus 2 divided by 100 is minus 2%. So, and now if you go back there, then you see, and here at this time series, I also showed you that in general, for the last 25 years, we had roughly, not the last 3 years, but all the other years, we had roughly an inflation rate measured by CPI of around 2%. But also during these times here, not only in the situation of the war in Ukraine, but also in history we had times where we had changes in energy prices of plus minus 10 or 20 percentage points. Well, and this then means if the general price level varies roughly between 1 and 2%, then in these times where the energy component has made these large fluctuations, more or less my whole price index was more or less only driven by the energy component. Although the energy component has only a weight of roughly 10%. And this you also have to keep in mind when you are focusing at a general political discussion. Well, price level is doing this and this and this. That sometimes we have the situation that inflation is maybe quite high, but the reason for high inflation could be only that, for example, this energy component has risen very much. Or this we also should not take too seriously that right now the price level came quite fast back to target. The reason for this is mainly that the energy prices have dropped the last 12, 18 months. And this we won't do in this course, but if we go more deeply in the calculation of consumer price index, then you also form a so-called core inflation. So what are the main or the the most goods which we are consuming, and there we see that this core inflation is still quite higher than 2%. And there you directly see quite a little problem for the central banks. Well, the overall price level has dropped quite much, but this core inflation rate, and then again we can go to the labor market. Well, your argumentation is then, well, okay, that I drive to my job, this is now a little bit less expensive. But in general, when I go to supermarket, when I go to a restaurant, when I make holidays and so on, all these prices are still rising much faster than 2%. Then again, you will go to your company and ask, well, I want to have 4 or 5% more for my work. I want to have a large increase of my wages. And somehow in this situation we are right now. Inflation rates in general have come down. But these core inflations where we are looking, well, if I go to a restaurant and I have to pay for a standard meal 30 euros or something like this, then I say, well, how should I afford this when if my wages are not increasing? So, in order to summarize, this means that in high fluctuating periods of energy prices, inflation can be mainly be driven almost only by this component. And of course in both directions. Okay, 10 minutes left. Then we will have a little start on the next aim, and this was high-level unemployment. And for this also we want to ask ourselves, how do we define unemployment, and what are the quantitative numbers for it, and what would we think of would be a good quantitative aim. So, in general, if we look at qualitatively at the statement high-level unemployment, then maybe in a first step we would say everybody should work. So full employment, but then if we think of it, should it be really the aim that everybody is working? Well, if we take a step back, then we can also think about our social system, so social security system. Well, in general, we are living in a free democracy, so we cannot force somebody to work. It is his own or her own decision to work or not. So what is then in general the aim? That we think of every willing person is in work. And this is then measured by unemployment, or in general by the unemployment rate. And then on Thursday we will come to this definition. But in general, when you take these who is willing to have a job, then this also means we will not have the quantitative aim that everybody has a job, and therefore roughly also in developed countries or in Germany as special, we would say that a situation with 3 to 4% unemployment rate, we will identify with a situation of full employment. So if we take this here, because of our social security system, we do not have the aim of unemployment rate of 0%. Because you can think of, well, due to our social security system, roughly you can say 1,000 euros or something like this I obtain every month if I'm not working. And this you then have to compare, and this is right now one of the main political discussions which we have. Think of the Bürgergeld, which we have introduced in Germany. Is it worth to work? Because then, for your own, you make the decision, should I work 40 hours per week, earning maybe 1,500 euros or something like this per month, or should I not work and being paid with roughly 1,000 euro without working? And of course, in a free country, this is the decision which you are allowed to be made. And we will see where this situation is going then in the next years. Because on the other hand, of course, if many people make the decision because of that not to work, this increases the public debt, the public expenses. Okay, and then we will look on Thursday also at the development and definition of unemployment. Then, thank you very much for today. So, where is it? There is it.